That's so confusing. I'm
I
saying, can you see that we're live? It says you're live on my
I'm
side.
gonna say
Jeez
go live.
Louise.
Going live. I'm clicking it on my end.
We're, we're
Now we've got
live.
an error.
You have an error. I see us as being live. It's technology's fun.
Error occurred. Please try again later.
Well, I can see us on YouTube. I can see myself and
I can't see anything.
okay. Well,
Okay,
I
let's
can
go
see. So
back out and back in.
you
You may have the
refresh.
delay.
We're all still going. I can see it's just like a 5 second delay.
There we go. I went
Okay.
back out and back in.
Yay. Okay.
Technology still in Mercury in retrograde.
It is Mercury in retrograde. I love to blame that for so many things. So let's do a quick introduction. Hello, everybody. It's Third Eye Salon. Welcome back, or if it's your first time, welcome aboard. Grab a seat, get comfy, get a hot cup of whatever your favorite drink is. And let's just do a quick introduction here. I can totally see myself in the background, so I know that we're good. All right. So on today's show, we have Dr. Jack Hunter, all the way from Wales. Jack, welcome aboard to Third Eye Salon.
Thank you. It's good to be aboard.
And we have the lovely Jillian. Jillian is going to be with us in conversation today as well. Hey, Jillian.
Hi, everybody. So I'm excited.
And thank you. And then Linda Coulter-Burge, psychic and conscious business coach. She's going to be juggling both the live stream chat and also popping in with great questions for Jack. Hey, Linda.
Hey, everybody. I am so excited because I think I'm the one that found Jack.
You are. I will give you full credit. She brought Jack into our Facebook group and was like, watch this. And I was like, amen. So that's what sparked it all. So thank you, Linda.
Yes.
So we're going to do just a little bit of touching in here before I hop into Jack's bio. And so on today's show, we are going to be taking a look between the veils of what it means to see all the intersections. It's kind of like we're pulling back the veil on the intersections of where all these different parts of the paranormal and spirituality and strange weirdness, where they all intersect, because Jack is so good at seeing all of the different pieces and how they connect and how they operate in parallel, as opposed to putting them in boxes and saying, well, that can't be so and that can't, those two don't really connect. Like, he's able to just hold it all in one space, and we're going to be peeling back the veil to see that kind of huge Venn diagram of where those things connect. So we do ask you to check out, oh, you know what? I don't know if I did this. We have a description box below. And in my fantasy, I remembered to put in all of our links in there. I'm not sure if I remembered to do that. If not, I will do it post. Linda's like, no, you didn't. So I will do that post show. I've gotten so good about that, but I dropped the ball on that one. So anyhow, we'll have tons of links there. It'll just be right after the show. I'll put those in there. So you can buy us a cup of coffee. I'll have links for Jack's page as well. And also he has a YouTube channel, so I'll put that in there. So we've got all that going on. We always ask that you would subscribe to our channel if you dig the conversation, that you would hit the notification bell so you know when we go live, and that you would just share the shows when you find something that you think other people would benefit from, and click the like and do all the engagement pieces that help us grow and help us grow with you as part of our community. So now what I will do is read Dr. Hunter's bio. So here we go. Jack Hunter, PhD, is an anthropologist exploring the borderlands of consciousness, religion, ecology, and the paranormal. He is a tutor with the Sophia Centre for the Study of Cosmology and Culture, University of Wales Trinity Saint David, and teaches masters in astrology and cultural astronomy and the masters in ecology and spirituality. He is a research fellow on the Alister Hardy Religious Experience Research Center, the University of Wales Trinity Saint David, and the Parapsychology Foundation, New York. Jack is also the co-editor with Dr. Tina Paphitis, or Paphitis. How do you say that, Jack?
Paphitis.
Paphitis, all right. Of the peer-reviewed Time and Mind Journal of Archaeology, Consciousness and Culture. He completed a permaculture design course at Chester Cathedral in 2017, and he worked on the One School, One Planet project between 2016 and 2019 to develop an interdisciplinary permaculture for a disciplinary permaculture curriculum for schools, which is awesome. Gosh, we have the kids doing this from the word go. That would be awesome. He is also a musician and an ordained Dudist priest, Dude, aka Big Lebowski. Jack lives in the hills of mid Wales with his adorable elven family. And I got to meet Niles and little Alice the other day at our pre-show, and they're just cute AF. So I'm also just gonna read through his research interests, because I've kind of created a little obstacle course for us today in terms of all these things that I want to go through and get Jack's thoughts and opinions on, because he's put his feet in so many different ponds. So let me just rip through this real quick so you guys can understand some of the range of his research interests: anthropology of religion, anthropology of the paranormal, parapsychology, religious studies, religious experience, anthropology of consciousness, ontological anthropology, spiritualism, spirit possession and shamanism, altered states of consciousness, anomalous and extraordinary experiences, spirits and entity encounters, paranormal pop culture, psychedelics. There's more that goes on here, but it's just like deep ecology, magic and the occult. So like you have a sense that he's waist high in all of these things that the mainstream culture, especially in academia, is like, we've sorted that one out and it's in a box and we've tucked it safely away, so we're good with that. And he's like, nope, not going to do that. We're going to dive in and go a little bit deeper. So again, welcome, Dr. Jack Hunter.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
You are so welcome. And he also has probably some of the best hair any of our guests have ever had. And I'm just a little hair envy, hashtag hair envy. So let's just kind of start in with where this all started for you, because in our chat, we were talking about deep weirdness, or the deeply weird, and just your curiosity about it, and how you were, because you have a PhD in anthropology, like within anthropology, if I'm getting that correctly, within anthropology, you're able to take on any number of different studies, because it all falls under the study of humanity and how we react as a culture. Am I tracking correctly?
Yeah, that's it. My understanding of anthropology is quite broad. So I take it to be, anthropology can be pretty much anything to do with studying human beings. Within that umbrella, the things that human beings do, there's so many different things. So anthropology is uniquely placed to look at these, niche kind of areas, but to delve into them. And it's had a whole big, long history of investigating things like magic, religion, supernatural beliefs, that kind of thing. And it's developed a framework for doing that is, in a sense, is not about passing judgment on other people's traditions. Okay, so there's a nice sort of a vibe within anthropology that is open to exploring other people's worldviews, but without trying to kind of explain it away. Although interestingly, and this is something that I've written about quite a lot, there has been a tendency within anthropology, as a discipline, to try and align itself with, the overarching materialist paradigms. So the overarching explanations that everything can be explained in terms of, matter or things like that. So anthropologists have tended to explain away other people's religions or other people's traditions in terms of social functions and things like that. Okay, so while they have been open in exploring these other worldviews, ultimately, when it comes down to it, most of the time, they kind of explain it away in some way. And my angle has been to try and think of, is there a way that we can engage with other people's worldviews, other people's beliefs and experiences, even if they're experiences of things that our dominant culture thinks of as, delusional or fraudulent or things like that. Can we look at those kind of critically and rationally, but engage with them on their own terms, rather than trying to reduce it into some other kind of an explanation? And then, when you start to do that and you start to engage with things like, especially, paranormal things or practices that involve trying to make contact with spirits, like mediumship and that kind of stuff. When you start to engage with those kinds of things in that way, non-reductively, then it opens up lots of different kinds of avenues for exploration. So that's kind of like my starting point, is to not try and explain things away, but to understand the complexity of, paranormal experiences or religious experiences or whatever.
Yeah, and that was when we were talking in our pre-show chat, where we were saying how, as opposed to being reductive, being more inclusive. Like the current science is it's so based on materialism that the drive is to understand it and put it in a box, but at the same time, it's all operating on the same frequency. It's all operating on the same dimension, and so if it's not in this dimension, then it's immediately discounted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's it. So anything that seems to, and this is a thing that science has got kind of like a general issue with. And you can see this when you look at things like the Gaia hypothesis, for example. The idea is that the Earth, according to James Lovelock's theory, is that the Earth is a single, homeostatic entity that maintains its like temperatures and things through all of these processes. So if you look at it in that way, you can understand it as, in terms of material systems and that kind of thing. So there's nothing extraordinary about that. But the fact that it tends towards complexity, the rainforests, for example, they move towards the most abundant biodiverse kind of systems possible. It seems as though there's a directionality in that. And science doesn't like the possibility. And this is why there have been these big debates about Gaia theory, about whether it is saying that the Earth is actually conscious and moving in a particular direction, or whether it's actually just random chance, mechanical processes. But science has got a real big issue with the possibility that there might be other kinds of, minds or intelligences out there, and will generally try to ignore that. And you can see how this is played out in terms of like animal consciousness and plant consciousness and that kind of thing. How it's only relatively recently that, there's been an international panel of scientists who've agreed that animals can feel pain and that kind of thing.
Oh my God.
Crazily. But, science is very cautious about attributing any kind of mind or intentionality or agency or purpose out, beyond human beings, really. So it's an interesting kind of area to be exploring.
Well, it's such an interesting, it creates this dilemma. Like there's this, I was talking to Michelle Ambergy the other night. She was someone we had on we had her on the show last week. And when she was just saying how like things have been dissected. So like, it's like there's science, there's religion, and then, there's like all of these different things that were pulled out, as opposed to them being, the intersections were just like taken away. Like these can't be intersected. They are directly in opposition to each other.
Yeah.
And
that's one of the things that I find interesting about paranormal research and those kind of things, or psychical research and parapsychology, is because they are disciplines that are at that interface between science and religion, for instance, because they're dealing, the psychical researchers and parapsychologists in the 19th century and 20th century, and even today, are thinking about issues of, survival of death and that kind of thing, but through a scientific lens. So it's kind of like parapsychology and psychical research are one of those overlap points between science and religion. But another one is like, in the history of science, you can go back and look at people like Isaac Newton, the big, you call them like the big daddies of physics and stuff like that. But, they were fully engaged in sort of alchemy and that kind of thing. So there's a much more complicated, relationship between science and religion than this binary kind of view that we're given by people like Richard Dawkins, for example. Or who was it who talked about non-overlapping magisteria, that there are these two domains that never overlap with each other, they're totally separate. But actually, when you look into the real world of how science operates and, the beliefs of scientists, actually, there is no neat line between science and religion. Actually, they blur into each other. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, there's a great historian of science called Andreas Sommer, think he's at Cambridge University, but he's got lots of great stuff. The Forbidden Histories videos on YouTube to check out about this weird relationship between magic and science and religion and science.
And what was his name again?
Andreas Sommer.
Andreas Sommer?
Yeah,
Sommer.
S-O-M-M-E. Yeah.
So can you spell the last name? Sorry.
Yeah, S-O-M-M-E-R.
Yeah.
Like summer, but with an O.
It's like it's a Brit version of what we have summer. We like,
Well,
you know what I mean?
German. Yeah.
Oh, it's German. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I know that names get like changed as they come to America. Everyone's like, "No, we can't say that, so we'll just make you Smith instead." It's like, I just lost my name. All right, Linda, you had a question. I wanted to make sure you got that popped in because I have like 10 questions in my head right now.
So I have a couple questions. The first one is, in dealing with other scientists, do you see that there is a disconnect between their personal beliefs and what they are compelled to justify in their science, to find in their science?
Yeah, well, I mean, most of my experiences within anthropology, which is a slightly strange science compared to a lot of sciences anyway, so the lines get blurred in anthropology quite a lot. But one thing that I've noticed in looking at the history of anthropology's engagement with, you know, things like the paranormal and the supernatural, is that anthropologists have had all sorts of extraordinary experiences, you know, whether they're participating in rituals in the field or, you know, even just in their personal lives. But very often when it comes to actually writing up, because anthropologists will go into a place, they'll observe stuff and they'll write it up into an ethnography, just like a text, a description of the culture that they've been immersed in. But very often when they do that and they're writing the publication, which will go into the scientific literature and be referenced by other people, they actually leave out those kinds of experiences, or like I was saying before, they will explain them away. So there's a really good example in anthropology from Evans Pritchard, who is again another one of these big daddy kind of characters in anthropology. You know, he's kind of like seen as one of the fathers of, you know, the anthropology of religion and that kind of thing. And he had an experience when he was researching. He was in where was he? In Sudan with the Azandi, and he was researching their beliefs in witchcraft and that kind of thing. And on this one particular night, he was in his hut writing up his notes, and he went outside and he saw this light floating through the bush, and it went off in the direction of another village. And he said, you know, he observed this light, and then he kind of went back into his hut. And then the next day he went and told the people in the village that he'd seen this, you know, orb essentially on its way to another village. And they said, "Oh, well, you must have seen witchcraft substance," because they believe that witchcraft is this substance that exists within the body that can come out and go and do nasty errands. But in his actual writing up of this, although he acknowledges that the native interpretation of this was that it was witchcraft, or that it was, you know, a magical paranormal event or supernatural event or whatever, he actually explained it away, and he said it was probably someone on his way to the toilet, you know, with a bunch of reeds that had been set on fire, you know, so he could see where he was going. So actually, when it comes to writing up his experience, although it was an anomalous experience, he kind of like made it into a joke or that kind of thing. And that kind of thing happens over and over again in anthropology, which is a shame. But then there was another kind of resurgence of anthropologists who wanted to move beyond that kind of approach and to, you know, to do a kind of experiential anthropology, where you incorporate your own experiences into your ethnographic writing. And there's an anthropologist, really great anthropologist called Edith Turner, who argued that, you know, the job of the anthropologist is to try and learn to see through the eyes, or to see what it's like to be, you know, somebody else, to see the kinds of things that they see. And she said, in order to do that, you know, the anthropologist can't be a detached observer standing on the outside of the, you know, the ritual with a pen and paper and making notes and that kind of thing. But the anthropologist has actually got to participate in and engage in the rituals and things. Nice. And she did this, and she emotionally participated in it. And in her ethnography, unlike Evans Pritchard, who explained it away and made a joke out of it, she describes in intricate detail the flow of the ritual process and how it builds up and there's emotional swells and all of that kind of stuff. And then eventually at the end of the ritual, that she sees, along with everybody else, this gray ectoplasmic kind of blob being extracted from the back of the patient. And she included all of that in her ethnography. So really, Edith Turner, in treating this, taking this experience seriously on its own terms and describing it ethnographically, not trying to explain it away, not even necessarily trying to explain it, but just describing the whole thing and not removing her own experience from the writing, she paved the way for other anthropologists to kind of engage with, the experience of ritual and that kind of thing. And that's where I took off with my own research, was to see what it would be like to do this kind of a participatory experiential anthropology, but with trance mediums in Bristol.
That was my next thing where I wanted to talk to you, is that I heard you talking about, most of the times that psychics and mediums are tested, they're taken out of their environment into a lab and in a very sterile environment, tested with very sterile circumstances, versus being in their own environment, feeding with the energy of everyone around them and the experience as the whole, and not being able to capture the same thing, and that you're wanting to capture it, and it's like an anthropologist in the natural state, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, there was an Italian anthropologist called Ernesto Di Martino, and he wrote about in the 1960s about, he's an interesting guy. He had funding from the Parapsychology Foundation, who I'm now a fellow of. But the Parapsychology Foundation has had this long history of funding anthropologists doing research, and Ernesto Di Martino was one of them. And he noted that when you look at the kinds of results that they get in parapsychological experiments in labs, even though they do get statistically significant results, that are above chance and whatever, which suggests that there is a genuine effect happening, these kinds of effects are so minuscule and small compared to the way that paranormal experiences really erupt in the real world. And he explained it how, this moving into the lab, he said it's a reduction of the drama, like the real life drama that really gives rise to paranormal experiences. So they're still getting an effect in the lab, but it's nothing like when someone has a crisis apparition of a dying loved one, or a deathbed vision, or sees a fairy, or any of those kind of things. It's much, much more reduced. So this is where I think anthropology has got a good, or can make a good contribution to, paranormal research, is through putting the paranormal or these experiences back into a process that is, a complex process that involves not only our psychological and physiological things and all the stuff that goes on in our bodies, but also the influence of culture and the influence of our social groups, that, the people that we're doing the rituals with or whatever, or the emotional and psychological state of the person who's having the experience. And that's what Edith Turner was able to do with her description of this process of having a really extraordinary paranormal experience. So you get to see some of those processes which are left out of laboratory experiments. So yeah, I think that's where anthropology's main kind of contribution to paranormal research is anyway, is showing that these things occur within complex networks of social and cultural and physiological and other kinds of processes.
Right. It's like you can take a fish and put it in a clear tank of water and observe it, or you can dive into the ocean and be with the fish and be connected to it's like, what has more data, like the fish in its environment living its life versus, like what kind of data are you going for? So, did you have another question, Linda? I don't want to cut you off because
I do. I have tons.
Okay. Okay. My turn. Okay, all right,
No,
fine.
you always have the turns. It's my
I know.
turn.
Usually I'm the question hog. I'll try to calm down.
It's hitting both sides of my brains right now.
Let's hear it.
They're
Let's
both
honor that.
firing, so
Yeah.
getting it back and forth. So, so my other question is, when you are looking at this as environment and everything else, how do you propose when people are in these experiences that they look at this as a whole? Sometimes I see people, and I try to, even when they're working with me, I see this desire to confirm their own beliefs through versus kind of being a little bit more analytic and looking at it, having some trust, but also kind of not trying to read into everything that I say. I have to stop and say, no, stop reading into what I'm telling you. Stop it.
So no, I think there's no kind of, it's not a simple thing. Again, it's a complex thing. There's no, every single person brings their own, baggage with them to any kind of thing. So everyone will react differently to different kinds of stimuli and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a hard thing, but I think it's definitely complicated. One way that I've been thinking about this issue recently is the relationship between culture and our expectations and the novelty of paranormal experiences, because it's quite clear, and you can look, if you do like a cross-cultural overview of the paranormal, which I have done, you'll see that there are cultural differences. It's pretty obvious. In one culture, ghosts present in one way, in another culture, ghosts present in another way. So it's clear that there are cultural frameworks that influence the way that people have experiences, but that in the moment of the actual experience itself, that it always shocks you. It's more than the cultural expectation, and there's always something a little bit extra as well. So you can see it's like there's an interaction between consciousness and our cultural models and expectations, and something else outside that is more than culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's a complex relationship between our expectations and this thing. So just because we might confirm our beliefs in a particular experience, for instance, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not also a genuine experience of something, even though it's being filtered through our particular frameworks. So it's
for me, I look at it in a way, because I try to look at, again, different cultures, different experiences with people, and find the differences and the commonalities. And for me, one of them is just that it is our attempt to explain that which we can't explain. And through our cultures, that's our biases that help us explain those things. Am I close?
No, yeah, I think you're right. I think our cultures are like our map of the world, and we get shown this map, through our education. So everyone who grows up in a particular culture will be given a particular map, which might be slightly different. But that the real world is, beyond the map. It's that famous saying, is it, that the map is not the territory, or something like that. The map is just the representation of the territory. And I think the same with even things like models of consciousness and things like that. That we have there's like a Western model of consciousness that anthropologists talk about, which is a bounded individual and all of those kind of things. But at the same time, you have within Western culture people who have experiences of the self that are multiple and diverse. So like mediums will have an experience of the self that includes, spirits and things coming into the self and that kind of thing. People who take psychedelics might experience a dissolution of the self. Zen Buddhists experience a dissolution of the self. So these things kind of like are beyond they're experiential things. They're not cultural things, and they're often actually challenge the cultural models, which are static, whereas the experience of the real thing is dynamic and always moving around. So yeah, that's kind of how I tend to think about it.
I love that. It makes me, this is such a good conversation, Linda, in terms of bringing up these cultural like parallels and where they connect and where they disconnect, because like I know I think it's in Japan, I believe, like when they're doing ghost hunting, or they're doing paranormal stuff, their thing is to swear just horribly at the ghosts, at the entities. It's like their practice is to like just swear the living dickens out of them. That's part of how you deal with like a disembodied spirit. Where, in America, it's just like a completely different thing, where it's either like you're trying to do a kumbaya where you're connecting with them, or maybe you're agitating them, but you're not just like talking about their mother in a horrible way,
Yeah.
So it's like, I think it's interesting that once you start to line these things up, it's like, well, why did this culture develop this expression, and this culture develop this expression, and how did it branch off in these ways? Like, what were the stories that were told?
Another interesting distinction is between like the Western like ghost hunting attitude towards ghosts, which is to go and hunt them,
right,
and to collect them essentially. And for example, indigenous perspectives. There's in my book Greening the Paranormal, which is an edited book with lots of different chapters by different authors. There's a chapter by Lance Foster, who is a member of the Iowa tribe, and he writes this. He retells the story of Plenty Coups, who was an Indian chief, Native American chief, and he has this encounter with a spirit in a river, and they have this ordeal with the spirit. And essentially they kind of escape from the spirit, but then they leave it an offering, and they decide that they're never going to go back there because they now know that is the habitat of the spirit. And I just thought that was, it's a completely different way of thinking about our relationship with these kinds of things. One way is to go and hunt them and to try and catch them Ghostbusters style in a trap. And the other way is to kind of acknowledge their existence and pay respect, but to then leave them to do their own thing. And I think, when you look at that kind of difference of way of understanding spirit, we're starting also to understand different cultural attitudes to the environment and that kind of stuff as well. These, that then the spiritual and our behaviors towards ecology are kind of related to each other. So our understanding of spirits, our understanding of the personhood of ecosystems and all of that kind of stuff influences the way that we interact with the world.
Let's dive into that. It's really cool. And I know that this is one of your, like, a passion that you're really living right now, in terms of bringing our awareness to our culture, to our relationship to Gaia, is how I would say it, to our ecology. Spirituality and ecology. And I would love for us to dive into like indigenous cultures and the roles of shamanism. And, and I like to talk about like spirit possession versus channeling, and like if it's the same thing, or like what your experience is. But like, because again, like I could talk to you for hours. This always happens. So it's like to dig into any part of that, wherever your mind went first, because my mind's like juggling three different things right now.
I'll touch on ecology and spirituality first.
Okay.
But I think, there is interesting stuff about channeling and spirit possession too. Maybe we'll get onto that later.
Okay.
But the ecology and spirituality thing, I've been, for the last couple of years, I actually started teaching it in October 2020. I've been developing this the new version of the MA in Ecology and Spirituality, which used to be taught through the Schumacher College in Devon, which is kind of like an alternative college, and it was like a residential course where people would go and sit with each other and talk and engage with nature and that kind of thing. But for various reasons, it didn't kind of work out, and it's moved now to a fully online mode of delivery, which is ideal for these pandemic times. So I started teaching this in October, but it's really given me the chance to think about this relationship between ecology and spirituality, because they're not things that you would necessarily equate with each other. In fact, you might even be less likely to equate, ecology and the paranormal, which is what Greening the Paranormal is about. But actually, I think there is a deep relationship. I think there's a deep relationship between the paranormal, which is kind of like the raw experiential side of spirituality, and kind of like, and more general spiritual attitudes to the world. So I think the paranormal is related to that whole strand of spirituality and understanding our relationship to the world. And as I've already said, our spiritual orientation is like our roadmap or our framework for living in the world. So it's obvious that there's a connection between spirituality and ecology. There was a historian of religion called Lynn White Jr., writing in the 1960s, a really famous paper where he argues actually that it's Christianity that's to blame for the ecological crisis because of the inherent attitudes within Christianity, towards separating the person or the individual or human beings from nature. In Genesis, like the world is created for Adam, for example. So humans have this sense of, ownership over it, which is very different to the kind of indigenous animistic worldview, which is about, not owning things, but living in good relationships with things. And Lynn White Jr. suggested, and he may be onto something with it, but there are also green strands within Christianity as well. We don't want to oversimplify anything, but he suggested that it was this shift away from an animistic worldview or spirituality or cosmology, which is about relationship, towards this Abrahamic Christian individualist kind of model. So, historians and people have been aware of this relationship for a long time. But what I'm trying to do is to take it into those, like we're saying, like the deeper, weird, more high strangeness kind of territory, which I think has been ignored in studies of spirituality and stuff. Because it's interesting, for instance, to note that people who have near-death experiences come back from those experiences often come back from those experiences, not necessarily all the time, with an enhanced sense of connection to the cosmos. A new vision of the cosmos as interconnected, and they often want to engage with pro-environmental kinds of behaviors. Similar things go for psychedelics. There's been a lot of research on lifetime use of psychedelics and how actually people who engage with those kinds of things over long periods of time often also develop pro-environmental attitudes, so understanding the world in that way. Even John Mack, the alien abduction researcher, argued that alien abductions are, essentially transmitting this message of the ecological crisis. So, the paranormal element of this has been ignored in favor of thinking about the mainstream religions and spirituality, but actually it's kind of, fundamentally entwined in there, which is why my perspective on the ecology spirituality thing might be a little bit different to other people's understanding of it. But yeah, so that's where I'm at, kind of thinking about, is that what's the relationship between ecology, the environmental crisis and our attitudes to all of that kind of stuff, and our inner cosmologies and our experiences of the world, and how we use them to build up our model. Because if we have experience of the world as animate, for example, we have interactions with trees or rocks where we have a sense of relationship and communication, then we behave differently.
Yeah. What I love about this is that you're able, because right there, you just took 3 areas, extraterrestrials, NDEs, and psychedelics, and said, there are a common theme that shows up in here in relationship to ecology. And that's one place where it shows up. It shows up in other areas as well. But my take on it is that, like, Christianity, and not just Christianity, because it shows up in other things as well in science and whatnot, where it's like this very hyper masculine entitled position of dominance, and it's my job to dominate and subjugate the earth, to dominate and subjugate women, to dominate and subjugate children. Like anything that it can get its hands on, I need to control it and put it into a box, and therefore everything is okay now because I've mastered it. It's a sense of mastery through domination. And all of these experiences through shamanism, through psychedelics, through near-death experiences, having the ET encounter, like all of this is saying, oh, that box, we just crumbled that box, and now here's the rest of everything else. And that's where people's minds just get blown.
Yeah, and the other thing about these kinds of experiences, and this is partly what I think is going on here, is that they put us back into the ecosystem. They show us that we're not actually separate from this whole thing. You know, so alien abduction experience, for example, is like a predator-prey kind of relationship. It's not necessarily a good thing, but what it does do is show that actually you're part of the food chain. There was another famous philosopher, Val Plumwood, who was kind of like an eco-feminist philosopher. And she had an experience of being attacked by an alligator or a crocodile or something. And it was that experience of being attacked and being in the jaws of a crocodile and inches from death and realizing that actually I'm not the master here, that led her to this eco perspective. And it's the same kind of idea with, I think, with paranormal experience. So it's not necessary to say that the aliens are necessarily trying to give us a positive message, although there are cases of contactees who do give an explicit positive message. Mm-hmm. You know, this is one of my problems, has been trying to reconcile why the alien abduction experience is so negative and frightening, and yet the outcome is positive. And I don't think it's actually got anything to do with the experience itself. It's to do with the being put into the ecosystem again. I might be wrong.
No, I think that really hits it, because we have shows about ETs all the time. So you know, my perspective on this is that, like, it's a negative experience. Well, there are some negative experiences where it is predator prey, where it's like, I am here to dominate you. And I love the idea of like that, but that's still being a blessing, because you're like, it still pops you out of, I am master of all. I am at the top of the food chain. Like, it still pops you out of that paradigm and puts you into a different relationship, which then leads to a spiritual awakening, an emotional, like some life catharsis, where you then become a different person in terms of your relationship to everything. But a lot of the ETs, like the first encounters, they are terrifying because they are out of that person's, you know, conscious cosmology, right? It doesn't fit into their conscious cosmology, but it's part of their underlying experience, because on a deeper level, they come to realize later on, oh, this is part of my tribe. This is part of my family. I was agreeing to this. And they have like conscious memories of these things that fill out that picture that before was just terrifying, where they were in the victim mode. And it's like being in a bad dream, where like you're in a nightmare and you're running from the guy with the knife, and then you stop and turn around and you confront the guy with the knife, and all of a sudden, because you stopped being in a reaction mode, then the relationship changes, and you're able to see what the purpose of it is, because you've gone out of the terror.
So it's the shock of the new, really. But you know, I'm not entirely sure about the alien abduction kind of thing, in terms of, you know, some of it seems to be positive for people, and some of it seems to be very negative. Mm-hmm. You know, again, it's a complex situation, and there may be different kinds of processes going on, and it's just as dangerous to assume that all of these encounters are positive as it is to assume that they're all negative, because the world is a messy place. And
yeah, it's complex, and I think you can never, like, how can you assume to know another entire race's intent and purpose? You know, like, how can you possibly understand all of that when they have their own complete culture, and you know,
and not just a single culture? You know, this is something I think of when I watch Star Trek. You know, the Klingons are all they all speak the same language, and they all wear the same clothes, but the Klingons are from a whole planet which must have lots of different Klingon cultures on it. So why do we never see the multicultural side of Klingon, you know, the Klingon species, or the Vulcans, or the Romulans, or whatever?
That's your next book right there.
The latest Star Trek actually does that.
Good.
this latest one, they actually have different cultures, which I thought was great.
Yeah,
I had the same
I did.
question.
I saw some of the beginning of Star Trek Discovery, and the Klingons at the beginning of that are very different, aren't they?
Yeah, and they have all different cultures within it. So
That's
I thought
good.
that was great.
Yeah,
Finally.
but they're taking on much more of a real world kind of anthropological way of thinking about the Klingons, which I like.
Yeah, it's not so two-dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
Jillian, you've been like so wonderful back there, but I know you're dying to ask some questions.
I do have questions completely unrelated to what we're talking about, but just things have been popping into my head for some reason during the conversation, so I'm going to bring them up.
Yep.
One thing that's been running through my mind a lot is synchronicity. Like the flow of synchronicity, how it comes in. With my experiences, I have experiences both with ET and with spirit. And the way it happens with me is I won't get anything for months, and then all of a sudden it will flow in and be a month or two full of interaction, but it seems to have a level of synchronicity with it, if you know what I mean.
So you're saying your spirit experiences and ET experiences synchronize with each other?
Right, they synchronize with each other, and they also seem to come in weird ways where it's all kind of interconnected. Mm. And the way, I've looked at synchronicity a little bit. I actually have a book coming on it. I'm so excited. I've ordered it like 2 days ago. But I feel like the phenomena of synchronicity runs on its own frequency. Mm. And do you have anything to say about that? Have you looked into that, or? Yeah, well, just recently I've been thinking about high strangeness. Yeah. And I found a great quote from Mike Cleland. I don't know if you know him. He's a UFO researcher and experiencer. And he says how in real life kind of paranormal experiences, kind of repeating what I've been saying, that real life paranormal experiences are very messy. But he takes it as a sign that the experience is kind of legitimate when synchronicities and all of these different kind of things spill over the edges, is kind of the way that he described it. So that you get this like a bubbling up of all of these different things at the same time. And he said that that's the time when you know that you're dealing with some kind of a genuine experience. So when someone comes to you as a researcher and says, I've had this happen to me, and then this has been happening to me, and then that's been happening to me, and it doesn't fit our neat compartmentalized view of the paranormal with a Bigfoot there and a fairy over there and a UFO there. But when actually you get the crazy experiences, the high strangeness experiences that have got spirits and aliens and Bigfoot, it might be too good to be true, or it could be an expression of the fact that the paranormal is, actually way more complicated than all of this kind of stuff. And that's what I mean too, about kind of running in its own frequency. Like when I get into those periods of time, it's almost like, I'll have a string of events, I'll be thinking about them, a song will pop in on the car, on the radio, it will be exactly what I'm thinking about. You know what I'm saying? Like, just, it's so strange how that happens. And it's such a big interest of mine now, where I've been going through it for so long. And I just, No, I think it's an interesting thing. I like Jung's view on it, his understanding of, how it's kind of when there is a synchronization between our internal world and the external world. And he had the great example that he was talking about, I think, when he was analyzing a patient, and they were talking about this vision of a scarab beetle. And just as they were talking about this vision, it smashes through the window. And so there's like a blending together of the inner psychological world and the external physical world. Right. Actually, it makes it seem as though there is less of a reason to think of them as two separate things. And Jung actually came up with this term that I love, of the psychoid. He talked about a psychoid principle, which is kind of like, it's like, I suppose you could think about it in a kind of symbiotic way. The psychoid is the place where these two, the physical and the spiritual or the mental, kind of meet. And that's what happens in a synchronistic experience. It's a psychoid experience, halfway between outside and inside, which is that's so interesting. Yeah, that paints a better picture of it. Because it's been 4 years now that I've been in this kind of into these things. Like the paranormal has been over a decade, but everything else, especially with the experiences being ramped up, it's only been about the past 4 years. So I hear things like this and it's so new to me and it makes so much sense. I just love it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Delicious. Would you talk about also then like where psychedelics and shamanism intersect?
Yeah.
I know it's kind of a big thing, but I just know that you're like a book. I just crack you open at any paragraph and be like, oh my God.
Yeah.
So
yeah, well, let's start off with shamanism first. Shamanism is a label essentially, and it comes from the Siberian Tungus people and Evenki people, kind of like up in the north of, you know, well, Siberia. And you know, it was a label initially that was intended for their practices, but when anthropologists in the 19th century started to explore, you know, they would encounter other traditions like this, and they would see that there were similarities between like what the Tungus and Evenki did, and say what the San Bushmen do, or with what, you know, Anishinaabe people do, or whatever, and say then, well, it's like a shamanism then is something that is universal, that lots of people do. Okay, but there's obviously problems with that because, you know, the shaman is a Tungus Evenki figure, but with, you know, we also have lots of other terms as well that are kind of synonymous with shamanism, like the medicine man or the witch doctor, or, you know, the healer, that kind of thing. Okay, so on the one hand then, shamanism is this pan-human thing. It's something that people do all over the world. It's kind of like magical. Anthropologists might refer to it as a magico-religious practice. It's somewhere between magic and religion. And the role of the shaman is basically to be kind of like a mediator between, or a medium, between the world of the spirits and the world of, you know, human beings. So they would, for example, you know, if you were reliant on hunting for your subsistence, then you would have a shaman who would go to the spirit world and communicate with the spirits of the deer or whatever, so that you could negotiate an agreement, so that, you know, when you go into the hunt, you know, if you give the right offerings, then you will be given one deer as a kind of an exchange. So this is the kind of the role of the shaman, is to negotiate these kinds of deals between the human world and the spiritual world. And the way that they do that, and this is where psychedelics comes in, is generally through some kind of an altered state of consciousness. And there's lots of different ways of getting into altered states of consciousness. Psychedelics and different kinds of psychoactive substances are one of them. But, you know, many shamanic traditions, you know, say shamanic traditions with this broad idea, but also being aware that it's not necessarily the right term.
It's like the shorthand, right? It's like the white man's shorthand to say, you know, this
indigenous magical religious practices.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what was I saying?
You're talking about how it all
yes,
different ways to.
Yeah, they're all different ways, and they use
the
consciousness to get to the spirit world. That's it.
Yes.
So some people will use psychoactive substances to do that. So if you go to like the Amazon rainforest and you speak with, you know, Yanomamo people, they use psychoactive snuff called yopo. And then, you know, you go to different areas and they use ayahuasca and yahe and all different kinds of drugs. There's talk of the Siberian Tungus people who we were talking about before using Amanita muscaria, you know, fly agaric mushrooms and that kind of thing. In Mexico and Central America, there's all of the various different kinds of mushrooms and other kinds of peyote and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these different ways, you know, iboga in Africa as well.
Wow.
African psychedelics often get left out for some reason, but actually there are psychedelic traditions in Africa as well. So yeah, they use drugs, but there are other people who use like
plant medicine.
medicines, yeah.
Plant medicine. I always like that trigger. Drugs is a trigger for me where I'm like, I think of drugs as like cocaine, heroin, things that have like very little redeeming value, and plant medicine as being something that's connected to the earth.
No, you're quite right.
Has a mission as opposed to getting messed up so you don't have to feel pain.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. So using substances from external from the body to get into altered states of consciousness. But you can also you can get into altered states of consciousness without bringing external substances in, through meditation, prayer, drumming, dancing, and all of that kind of stuff. So this is the role of, psychedelics and other kinds of psychoactive substances, but also of drumming and different kinds of trance induction techniques. Because when you get into that altered state, then the idea is that you are able to commune with the spirits. And, unsurprisingly, even in recreational circumstances, people have interactions with non-human intelligences, when they're in altered states of consciousness, whether we're talking about dreams or, drug states, psychoactive plant medicine states. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a question, Linda?
I was just looking at the comments and checking.
Okay. All right. I want to make sure because it's, yeah. Well, thank you. And yeah, I think that, there's again, that part where it plays with ecology where, these psychedelic states, the people who are connected to the earth, like you're not going to tear up your medicine and burn it to make a condo. Like there's all these things that we just miss because, for me, like marijuana or cannabis, I call it cannabis, is a plant medicine. And we just have, the idea is that you're going to bliss out and you're just going to like laugh and giggle or whatever. Or like, for me, it's like, that's when I use it to connect more deeply to my body and more deeply to my guides. But in our culture, we just don't have, since again, it's our cultural framework, it's about disconnection. It's about releasing the pain that our culture creates. And here are the drugs to release the pain, as opposed to here's the medicine to help you connect deeper so you can get through the pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, yeah, there's definitely a cultural attitudes towards these kinds of medicines that holds us back. I mean, in the UK, we've got a very kind of backwards attitude towards all of this kind of stuff. And, over there in the US, you've actually got quite a bit more progress on that front with decriminalization of, lots of sacred medicines, but also of, cannabis and things for people to use. But here we seem to be stuck in the Victorian times. Although actually the Victorian times, they had access to all sorts of crazy stuff. We're not even stuck in the Victorian times.
What were they doing in the Victorian times? I have my idea, but it's your history, so I don't want to like.
Well, no, they were discovering opiates and laudanum and all sorts of different kinds of things were readily available.
Yeah, like snuff was a way to like inject, like not heroin, but something like that into your body.
Snuff is tobacco, yeah. Tobacco, you get a real tobacco rush.
Okay. So what would then be, let's kind of talk about some more of these overlays. Then what is your connection, or what have you seen the parallels between psychedelics and near-death experiences? Like when what have you stumbled across in terms of things that have been parallels?
Yeah, I like to see parallels and I like to look for these kinds of connections, but I also am wary of the fact that it's easy to conflate things as well. Mm-hmm. So while there are similarities, I also think that there are differences.
Oh yeah,
lots and lots of differences, and that's a good thing for the world. So psychedelics have similar effects to near-death experiences and things like that. But that's not necessarily to say that they have precisely the same kind of effects or the same kinds of experiences. So I think that there might be, and this is why I like to think in terms of processes, is that, psychedelics and near-death experiences, although they're very different things, might have similar underlying processes going on. It's another thing I like to think about in the work of, have you encountered the work of Anthony Peake? He talks about sort of like neurological things, you know, like when people have that condition where they see lots of little people and stuff like that. But that these neurological conditions might be kind of gateways to this other world, which explains, you know, why people who are, you know, have dementia and stuff like that, for example, seem to be in contact with spiritual beings and that kind of thing. So I like this idea, but obviously there's a difference between, for example, like schizophrenia, which can be very pathological and negative kind of experience for someone, and people who have, on the other hand, hear voices or have visions or hear spirits talking to them. So I think the similarities lie in the fact that there are similar processes that underlie these, but they're not the same thing, that they are two distinct kinds of thing, but with underlying similar processes. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that, and I can't quote the names. You're so good at, like, because you're just so well read, and you have all of this has been in, these names have been poured into your research and whatnot. So you're able to like whip out names and direct stories from these people. So here I'm going to be very clunky. There's somebody that I read once upon a time who was, had gone, who was immersed in indigenous cultures, and that was their thing. And then they came to America, and then they went to places where, people were having psychological breaks, and they were, being put into institutions. And as he was going through the institution, he's like, well, these people are having spiritual awakenings. But it's like, I think the difference is that there's no one to midwife them through the rest of it. So they're left with a continuum that they don't understand. They're left with an environment, an internal environment that has no markers, that has no pathway. They're Alice in Wonderland without the white rabbit guiding them through, like they're just left to figure it out, versus there being someone there to get them the rest of the way. And somebody like Linda, who can hear voices, literal hear voices, and is clairaudient, like she went through that process too of like, well, am I a little crazy, or is this something bigger? And she, but she had the wherewithal to do her own research, because she wasn't being impacted to the degree where she couldn't function in the world. It was more like, I just want to make sure I'm not crazy. Yeah. So
yeah, I actually, just to fill in the blanks there, Jack, I went for a year to dialectic behavior therapy class with a therapist that I actually didn't tell him the full story, but really wanted to know, am I crazy? I'm hearing these voices that are saying, like, watch out when I'm walking up to a corner and I stop and there's black ice around the corner that I can't see. Right? That's my kind of experience. So I spent a year with a group. He couldn't have put me with a better group of people. The entire group was schizophrenics and bipolar. So that and they openly would talk to me about the voices that they heard. And there were actually 2 people within there that I knew were somewhere on that spectrum. One of them I became really good friends with, that she finally divulged to me that she could see, she asked me about, she made a comment that she was afraid to go in a closet. And why? Because that was her comfort zone. And she said, because that's where the cat is. And I remembered going to her home before, and there were cats, and I didn't see any cats. And, when we started exploring it, I believe it was the ghost of the cat that she was dealing with. Once we came to that, and she was okay. Like, it was all right. It was not, the cat's not telling her to do evil things. There were very different, we talked about the difference of what she was seeing versus the voices that she heard that told her to do bad things. Yeah, she was in that very different realm where she was hearing a schizophrenic having schizophrenic events, but she was also seeing things through that veil. Someone who had passed away, the cat. And just me being able to have that conversation with her, she didn't feel so crazy. She was like, oh, I can deal with this. Now that I know this is. I can deal with this and that, now I can see the difference.
Yeah, one of the things that I noted when I was doing my field work with the Bristol Spirit Lodge, which is this mediumship development circle in Bristol, was that they, people would have these mediumship experiences that would sometimes erupt in their lives spontaneously. So they would start having certain kinds of experiences, or they would start hearing voices or things like that. Or sometimes the mediums would come into it through, family links and that kind of stuff. But for the people who it happened spontaneously to, they would turn to these groups like the Bristol Spirit Lodge as a place to, as a port of call for trying to make sense of these experiences. And what I found was, and I think other people have noted this as well, was that these places provided that kind of safe space for, basically for what I call in a way like domesticating anomalous experiences. So you kind of you have a place where you go for that kind of experience. When you set boundaries, this is what the circle leader said to me, was that you set boundaries with the spirits and say, if you're going to be bothering me or whatever, we're going to do it at this particular time in this particular location. So this is another reason why these kinds of practices or these kinds of groups, you can't understand them in terms of the old, like, oh, it's all fraud or it's all delusion, because actually they do perform these other kinds of functions for people. They provide safe spaces for exploring, mental phenomena. There's much more going on than, just blanket dismissal of it. So yeah, I think there are like therapeutic potentials for these kinds of mediumship development, but also for having an understanding that extraordinary experiences and stuff like that are not actually uncommon and that actually lots of different people have these experiences. I wrote a chapter in a really good book about, it's called Continuing Bonds in Bereavement. And it's all about how, when you're bereaved, sometimes it makes sense to continue a relationship with the dead loved one, rather than cutting off and severing any kind of connection and dead is dead, but actually to, engage with the process, that it can have, lasting therapeutic benefits, which is quite interesting. And it's also interesting to note in that context that lots of people, at those times, those liminal times when people have passed away and things like that, will have ghostly experiences of them. And, my auntie told me an experience of seeing her husband after he died. She's a very matter-of-fact kind of person in a lot of ways, but she nevertheless had this experience. And so when you know that it's a common experience and it happens to you, then actually you think, well, maybe I'm not crazy and I can get on with this. Other people have dealt with it as well. So I think that these are important conversations that need to be had, really, because there are different ways of understanding hallucinations, of understanding visions, and all of that kind of stuff.
Jack, I think you just defined Third Eye Salon.
Great.
So when we're talking about that, then in terms of opening up these new relationships and bridging the gaps, and again, like I feel like you're so rooted in the indigenous, like there's this indigenous framework that you're using with your work with ecology and parapsychology and the paranormal. Because the indigenous cultures didn't freak out and label it and say, oh, that's weird, we don't talk about that. Like, so there's this much more rich cultural texture there because it's just par for course. It's like you're saying in the beginning, like, oh, there's witch energy flying through the air. Like they just had a name for it. They weren't going to be like, they weren't dismissive. So when I think about like what it is that's happening on the planet and how the indigenous cultures have better solutions than we do. And I wanted to get into like, what are their solutions for the planet? And how does that show up in terms of their connection with extraterrestrials? Like, because in a lot of our conversations we've had here, like extraterrestrials and indigenous people, like that's par for course. It's like, yeah, the indigenous people, it's part of their history. It's just very clear and common. And what has been yours when you've stumbled across that information? What's your data around that?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things to unpack in this. I think
why you're on the show.
Yeah, I think the key theme, a key strand that runs through all of this is the idea of, well, two interrelated things really. One is non-human consciousness, and indigenous cultures, like we've already mentioned, indigenous cultures recognize that there are other forms of consciousness. They recognize that plants and trees, also possess consciousness from the get-go. And so, the extension goes off into the cosmos as well, because the world is the universe is a living thing. There will be life. It's kind of expected, and it's a part of the cultural model. The planets may be alive and all of that kind of stuff. This is really what astrology is all about, that the planets, in some sense, have their own characters and personalities, and that they impart that into the world, in some way. So that when we are born, we are aligned with these different non-human intelligences. So all of this really, and the paranormal as well, is to do with animism. Recognizing that the world is full of relationship, or the world is full of intelligences and consciousnesses. And indigenous traditions, like I've already said, are all about establishing a good relationship with those non-human intelligences. And like I've also already said, in our Western framework, that we have the scientific worldview that has overtaken and has replaced not only the animistic worldview, which was replaced by the religious worldview, but has removed essentially any kind of intelligence or agency from the cosmos. So now it's a surprise when we find that plants are conscious and that kind of thing. But that's part of the problem, and I think that is also what has led to this ecological crisis, because it is a Western, or it's an industrial kind of problem. It's an industrial worldview problem, isn't it? And we don't see the industrial worldview doesn't see the world as about forming relationships or living symbiotically with other beings. It sees, like we've already said, the human as central and in control, having mastery over things. And that's what's led to this situation. So when you're asking, what can indigenous traditions, or what can the indigenous kind of thing add, I think one of the key things is there's a few things that the indigenous perspective can tell us. One is to recognize the place that we're in, the world, the particular location that we're in. Doesn't matter whether we're in the countryside or whether we're in, the middle of the city or whatever, but is to, re-indigenize to the place and learn to live, this is the second key thing, in relationships with the things that constitute the environment around us. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's not necessarily about taking an indigenous practice or anything like that, which might be in fact understood as cultural appropriation and that kind of thing. It's more to do, and this is what there's a great indigenous Australian writer called Tyson Yunkaporta, and he talks about how he's gone to all of these conferences where they talked about the role of indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and that kind of thing. And he says that that's not the point. The point is the way that indigenous people think. So he says what he wants to do is to bring this indigenous pattern thinking and then apply that to, the situation. So it's not to take any one particular practice or anything like that. It's actually more to think, well, what are the overarching patterns here? And how do we kind of engage with that in our own way, not taking other people's traditions, but participate in our own place and use those kind of understandings of relationship. And I think when we do that, there are certain things that can give us clues and tips about how to form those relationships. So if we look at, for example, our folklore, or the stories that people have told about the places that we live, or the ghost stories and things like that exist in a particular area, all of those things help us to connect or to form a relationship with the place that we're in. So this is why I'm so passionate about reconnecting to our local folklore, because it reveals that actually the river already has a name that we can engage with, or that this area here is already, fairy territory and things like that. Once you are aware of that, I mean, you don't even necessarily have to be aware of that. You can go and engage in those places and then it comes forward anyway. But if you realize that there was, our ancestors had already given names to the land and had already established relationships, then it's really a matter of rediscovering our own indigenous perspective. And I think the paranormal and all that stuff that is kind of like, people might think of, anthropologists in the past would talk about these things as survivals of primitive worldviews, belief in spirits and that kind of stuff. It's still there in our Western culture. But, so the paranormal is kind of what's left of that in the West. And it is, when you look at the paranormal, all about it's about interconnection through things like telepathy, and it's about there being more of a relationship between the mind and the body in terms of psychokinesis and that kind of stuff. And it's also about the fact that there are other intelligences out there, whether we're talking about extraterrestrial ones, monsters, the Loch Ness monster. There's a great story. There's a Buddhist monastery by Loch Ness, and the abbot of the monastery said that Nessie is a naga, and then in Tibetan Buddhism, the naga is a water spirit. So it fits within that way of thinking about things, which is pretty cool.
God, I've never heard that before. That gave me chills, because the Naga are like the snake people. It's the sacred snake people.
Yeah.
Which I have a connection to. So that we're all in the woo-woo. But like, I love that. Well, and the thing that occurs to me in this is that, like, the paranormal is what we call the paranormal is what the Western world cut themselves off from. So we had these maps, we had these relationships, we had these names, we had this wisdom, we cut ourselves off to, but it stayed there. So it's this bubble that we keep bouncing into. Had we not cut ourselves off, then it wouldn't be a bubble that we're like knocking our heads against and being like, get your EMF meter, I think there's a spirit here. Like, it's this very like outside to the inside, because we lost the original relationship, which that's our way of introducing it back into our culture, back into our consciousness. But it's because we cut it off that we have this response of like ghost hunting versus sacred ancestry, and what we do with our ancestors and how we connect with them once they've passed over. If there's a lost spirit, the shaman of the village is the one who will help that lost spirit, cross over. That continuum was killed in the name of science and domination. So in terms of extraterrestrials, I just see them as somebody who, again, don't have the disconnection, because they can exist in multiple worlds and multiple realms. So in the indigenous stories that I hear and know of, and this is my informal research speaking, not my not my master's or my degree, but like, it's like, we learned how to do this from from the star people. We learned this from our sacred ancestors who are this star tribe over here. And so like, their induction into this relationship to Gaia is a continuum from the word go, where that was never disconnected. I don't know what, we had. And
in the West, we disconnected ourselves from it. But again, this is another issue that it's not true to say that, just as we can't say, like, for example, that the Western individual self, every single person in the Western world is the Western bounded individual, because that's not the case.
Right.
So there are also many, many Western traditions that do have, or do place central significance on having a relationship with, the spiritual realm. I mean, astrology is one example, a big Western tradition, but it's all about understanding our relationship with the wider cosmos. All sorts of different kinds of, practices within the West. Alchemy, again, is a different way of thinking about the relationship of mind and matter, for instance, but it's still a Western tradition. Spiritualism is a Western tradition, but it's all about connecting with spirits. So there are traditions within the West that are also running in that same kind of territory. And of course, there are also indigenous Western traditions as well. So, when we talk about, for example, the Sami in Lapland, they have a shamanistic tradition. They go to the spirit world and communicate with spirits. But there are people indigenous people who live right up in the very north of Norway and Sweden and those kinds of places. Fully a Western culture, but it's a Western animistic culture. Oh. And you could also look at, say, for example, Norse religions and all of those other traditions, Druidry, although it doesn't have it's not got a nice seamless lineage. It gets cut in places like that, but you could still argue that it is, or it's a debate that continues really, but whether Druidry is an indigenous tradition. Okay, it's a Western tradition and it's an indigenous tradition. And living here in Wales, for instance, very interesting that there would have been, obviously, as with everywhere, a Welsh traditional ecological knowledge, just as there are indigenous American traditional ecological knowledge and all that kind of stuff. And in Wales, through the same processes of colonialization and that kind of stuff, Wales has been continuously invaded and dominated by England, which is just next door. Over the years, the traditional Welsh ways have been lost, but they would have been there somewhere, and they might be embedded in the folklore or embedded in the remnants of Druidry and that kind of thing. So I think there's an interesting time now to, especially in light of our ecological crisis, and in light of the fact that we now have to spend a lot more time rooted in our particular locations, that we should start to re-engage with our local folklore and find out about the spirits and things that already dwell here that we've just forgotten about. Yeah.
I look at everything too. I mean, one of my favorite authors growing up, being the geek kid that I was Joseph Campbell, and talking about, listening to his discussions about the psyche and our oral traditions that came down, or written traditions that came down across cultures, and the similarities because of the lessons that were being taught through that. And he called it folklore. But for me, I always sit there and think about, how does that merge with what I'm seeing here? Is this a lesson being taught through this message? Is this a universal language that's coming out through us? I'd love to hear your take on that as well.
Yeah. Well, about whether myth is like a universal message and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I think that there is within myth a connection to this animistic, ancestral way of living in the world. And, the reason that myths and things like that sound so extraordinary and bizarre to us is because, we no longer participate in myth. It's become like stories and, stories that we don't live. We talk about the mythical world as something that either never existed or it was a long time ago and we'll never access it. But people do enter into the realm of myth on a regular basis, in dreams, in various altered states of consciousness, and this is why, Jung and those guys would talk about archetypes, these characters that we encounter in our altered states who are also present in myths. So that it's almost as though there is like another kind of realm that we go to where we do participate in the mythical. So I think, where do we draw the line between myths as stories and then myths as kind of like lived experiences? I was reading just yesterday, I'm writing something about high strangeness, and there's a parapsychologist called George Hansen who's really famous for his trickster theory of psi. But I was reading this article that he wrote way back in 1991 about the parapsychologist D. Scott Rogo, and he was talking about how D. Scott Rogo was really good because he embraced the weirdest side, the weirdest elements of the paranormal, not just the stuff that was going on in the labs, but also the the strange encounters that people have, even with mythical beings and things like that. So sometimes myth becomes real. When people have experiences of vampires and stuff like that, for instance. I don't know where the line, where we can draw the line, really.
What
I don't know if that's added anything to your conundrum.
Expanded it. What's your experience of people and experiencing vampires? What have you run across with that? I know that's a total deviation, but because I also love the paranormal, and we could have just made their show strictly on the paranormal, but I had an agenda. But what is your knowledge about people experiencing vampires in a real way, like energy vampires, or what do you?
Well, it's not something that I've researched in any detail.
Okay.
But I've always been interested in vampires, and I do know that there are people. This is something I like to think about. I think about this a lot with my students about vampires and identities and things like that, and how there are some people who are born into the world and they feel a real radical disconnect between their inner sense of who they are and what culture allows them to be. And maybe this is another example of that idea of the self being something that's much more expansive than any kind of cultural model. So that sometimes people are born with an expanded sense of self that never fits into the cultural model. And some of those people, perceive themselves, or they feel as though they are vampires, and that they need to drain. Maybe some will drink blood, and maybe some will just be like energy vampires or whatever, but they feel in their self that is who they truly are. And I just find that such a fascinating thing, that there are these other ways that people understand themselves. And it's not just vampires, there are whole loads of different varieties. I met a sociologist once who was researching these groups. He was talking about otherkin, these people who believe that, or feel in themselves, it's their inner conviction that they're fairies or that they're an elf or something like that. Mm-hmm. I just wonder, how can we be sure that they're not, or whatever? It's a kind of similar issue with the gender kind of thing. We feel our inner self, who we really are. So we have all of this new scope now for many different forms of gender, but I also wonder about many different forms of personhood, or other ways that people might identify, not even as human, but as other kinds of beings. It's fascinating, and I think it's going to proliferate, and we're going to end up in an interesting situation where there are many, many forms of self and self-expression.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you come at it from it's like we really are looking at two sides or multiple sides of one thing, because on our show and in our experiences, it's like somebody comes on and they're like, well, I'm an ET soul, I am from someplace else, and it'd be totally in alignment with our show for someone to say, well, I'm actually a fairy soul. And I'd be like, yep, okay, let's talk about it. Like, I wouldn't blink, right? I would just be like, let's make room and let's explore that. And the fact that you are able to look at it from this other realm and then parallel it to like people's breaking down the definition of gender. Why are there just two definitions of gender? Oh, there are actually more now, we're claiming more. And how this is another continuum of the lines dissolving and people emerging in such a way that they're no longer contained within that label.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's discovering the extents of the self beyond the cultural model. And that's the kind of thing that, binds all of this stuff together, whether we're talking about alien abduction experiences or psychedelic experiences or mediumship experiences or whatever.
Yeah.
It's feeling out beyond the cultural models into the pre-cultural self that exists, the real thing.
The pre-cultural self. That's a hashtag pre-cultural self. That's a great, I like that.
Yeah. I think it's, I think the self is pre-cultural. We assume that we're given our self when we're born and that we're taught it, all of that kind of stuff. But actually we don't. We experience it, and everyone has their own individual, unique self that's informed by their own experiences. And, we don't all take the norms and values of society as a given. Some of us will take some things and others will take others. So it's more like we have to map it out for ourselves. Some people choose just to stick within a rigid, defined box of what culture says the self should be, and other people will slip out of that spontaneously. Some people will deliberately move beyond it as well.
Well, and I think about in some Native American cultures, again, I can't quote things the way that you quote things. That makes me so brain envy. But the indigenous cultures that I've read about, where a baby's born and they'll put one object and another object out in front of the baby, and one represents the masculine, one represents the feminine. So if it's a male baby and they grab the item on the blanket that represents the feminine, they're like, oh, two spirit person. Oh, this is a person. There's some inclusion of the baby choosing who they are through a ritual, and that informs the tribe about who they are. Which in our culture, it's don't wear pink, you're a baby boy. It's there's a fear of deviation from that those predestined roles.
Yeah, definitely, it is. I think it is to do with ultimately our understanding of the self. And indigenous cultures, the self is not necessarily bounded, but can contain our relatives and our ancestors, and the elements of the environment around us can be an important part of ourself. Like you said, they trace ancestry back not just through a single species, but actually through, you may have plant and animal ancestors, or you may have star ancestors. And our Western model is very human-centric, and that's led us down the dual treacherous route of the ecological crisis, but also of ignoring this whole spiritual thing as well.
Mm-hmm. Which go hand in hand. It's like a disease that spread in many different, anything that was, oh God, don't get me started. So I want to make sure, Miss Linda or Miss Jillian, do you have any other questions to pop in with, or questions from the audience that may have been attending? Not sure what our audience is like today.
Yeah, they're listening very carefully, making comments here and there. I'd encourage you to go back and look at the comments and address some of them. One person, I will not say who it is at this point, you're just going to have to figure it out, actually spoke at one of your classes that's watching today.
Oh, God, that's so
you're
cool.
You're just going to have to look to see.
Great.
I want to take a left turn.
Yeah, take it.
And it was the pre-consciousness of being that I remember how I was murdered in my past life. I remembered it when I was a baby. So I would love to have you, Renee B is actually saying, hey, Jack. So,
hello.
But I'm curious what your thoughts are on reincarnation, because that is something that, I kind of just, when I was little, I just accepted that this was something that was a tape that would roll in my sleep every night. And it wasn't until I became close to the age that I died that actually that connection really took place. And it was either you deal with it or you go back because you haven't dealt with it.
It's either going to kill you or you have to embrace what the
right.
wound
my
is.
come to Jesus moment.
Yeah.
Get your shit together or you go back.
I think there's some good evidence for reincarnation. And there's some interesting research by some parapsychologists. Ian Stevenson is very famous for his research on reincarnation. More recently, a great book called, Signs of Reincarnation was published by a colleague of mine in the Parapsychology Foundation, Jim Matlock. So if you're interested, that's a great thing to check out. And there's
Signs
also
of Reincarnation. I'm going to write that down. Signs of Reincarnation, Jim Matlock.
Here it is. And another
Born in the
interesting avenue for you to explore would be the work of Antonia Mills, who was actually an anthropologist who worked with Ian Stevenson researching reincarnation, but in indigenous American traditions. So there's some homework for you.
Excellent. Anything, Miss Jillian, that you want to pop in with?
Yeah, well, just going back a bit, I like what you were saying about continuing the communication while in bereavement or while in grief. I had a boyfriend who passed away a couple of years ago while I was pregnant with our son. And after he passed, I mean, I've had my awakening 3 years before that. So he was very aware of how I picked up on energies and how I picked up on spirits and so on and so on. So after he passed, it was instant that I was getting the communication. But I think where I kind of leaned into that belief and into that side, it made the whole situation so much easier to go through. I'm a huge advocate for that. If someone is open to those possibilities, I think it's so important that they are followed.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there needs to be a space within, you know, not just psychiatry, but, you know, mental health, but also in medicine for these kinds of things, for an awareness of them, and not just to think of them in terms of, like you're saying, hallucinations or pathology or anything like that. I got another little tip for you to follow up if you're interested. Natalie Tobert, or Tobert, Tobert. She has written some great stuff about cultural sensitivity, but especially in relation to spiritual beliefs, you know, in ancestors and that kind of stuff, but specifically geared towards people who are dealing, you know, who are trained to be nurses or things like that. It's important to be aware of those kind of things.
That's great. I just wrote it down. It is important. And same with, I mean, even nurses who are working on the psychiatric ward. And I know you were talking about, you know, if you have schizophrenia and this and that, but then it also makes me think of maybe short-term psychosis. And it goes into all those of maybe, you know, some people when they are in a psychosis, whether it's naturally or through drug induced, it seems to have a theme sometimes. And it kind of, to me, like my view on it, it kind of can coincide with an awakening. And I think it's important for nurses in those fields to just be aware of those possibilities. And I mean, not that they would have to be their concrete belief, but at least be able to look into those possibilities. Same with psychiatrists who are dealing with those patients. And
to have a framework within which it makes sense, I think would be a good step forward.
Some kind of reference to it at least.
Definitely.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Jillian.
You're welcome.
So Dr. Jack Hunter, Greening the Paranormal, that was a book that you edited, right? Okay. So do you want to speak to that and where that book and where people can find it?
Yeah, Greening the Paranormal, you can buy it on pretty much any online bookstore, or you just do a Google search for it, you should be able to find it. There's a couple of other books that people might be interested in as well. One is Spirits, Gods and Magic, which is an introduction to the anthropology of the supernatural. It's just a little book, but it's kind of like, I'm actually going to be doing a 5-week course based around the book later on in the summer. But it's quite fun if you were interested in a cross-cultural view of the paranormal. And then
putting that in our group, right? So that
I will do.
Spirits, God and Magic.
Spirits, Gods and Magic, yeah.
Gods.
Not just one God, many gods. And what was the other thing? Yes, my most recent book was actually my PhD thesis, which is all of my research on mediumship and the paranormal. It's called Manifesting Spirits, and it was just published in December. So if you're interested in finding out about the world of physical and trance mediumship and all of that kind of stuff, that's your place to go.
Excellent. Manifesting Spirits. That is your new book. And so they can, if people just Google Manifesting Spirits, Dr. Jack Hunter, they're going to find where to get it, right?
Should do, yeah.
Yeah. You obviously wouldn't bury that somewhere. I know sometimes there's a break between academia and, you know, the rest of the world. So I just want to make sure it's like accessible.
I like to be accessible.
You are, and you are very accessible. You're, what great fun. And your voice is so soothing. Like on the side, you could just be reading books and be one of those people that like reads books and it goes into Audible, and we could just listen to your voice and so warm and delicious. Yeah. Is there any other final thing? Because it's weird. We've gone for like over an hour and a half. So we should probably let people wrap it up and go on with what they need to do.
I have people who have more questions. So if you ever want to step into the group and answer some questions.
I will get into it afterwards.
Yeah,
and I'll look at the comments as well.
Any last burning questions you want to give, Linda, or do you want to keep it for?
Well, one of them was would love you to talk more about alchemy. So perhaps that's something that's kind of a big topic, but maybe something to address in the group, or have you back on these.
Yeah, perhaps we can just have you come back on the show.
Yeah.
If you had a nice time today, and you could we could maybe find some of those things that people wanted to talk about and be Dr. Jack Hunter Part 2.
Definitely. Why not?
And I tried to capture the books that you mentioned in the chat, but if you want to provide any books, we can put them in our reading list.
Great.
So would love that.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. And I would also just like to have you back on the show, Jack, in terms of when we're having something that is really woo-woo out there, where you might, if you want, like to be there and be this other part where you're coming at it from this, you know, this researched academic, but, you know, but still heart connected view. So it might be fun for you. Would you be down for that?
Sure. As long as you can schedule it in somewhere.
Yeah, as long as it's not going to be in a conflict. But I mean, it's not too bad though. Like 5 p.m. your time.
We can work something out.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, let's formally thank Dr. Jack Hunter for being on the show. Thank you so much, friend. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And then Miss Jillian, thank you for being here with your warmth, your grace, and your awesome questions.
Oh, no problem. It was fun.
And Miss Linda, of course, I appreciate you multitasking with your Shiva arms, doing all the things at once, and with your great insight and questions. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate the conversations going on the side, and I know they will continue as more people watch this show. So we'll be checking back in. Love that you're here. You add so much to the show when you start adding questions. Gives us a lot to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, feel free to please subscribe. And we have a Facebook group. I will put the information down as soon as we're done. I'll get all of our links downloaded below. We have a Facebook group. If you want to support us, Ko-fi.com or coffee, it's ko-fi, but I'll get the link underneath there. And if you want to buy us a virtual coffee, that is great. And as always, just be kind to yourself, be kind to the world, live from your heart. We care about you. We're glad that you're here. We're glad that you're here. And thank you for being with us today. And we'll see you next time on Third Eye Salon. Thanks, everybody.